Sonic Rush, which came out in 2005, is a game loved by many Sonic fans, even people outside of the fandom singing its praises pretty regularly. Many people love it for differing reasons. It's stylistic, it's innovative, and it has the kind of presence that demands your attention. It wasn't perfect, but the influence the game has on Sonic in general cannot be overstated. Even so, another game came out just 2 years later in 2007, a sequel to the beloved game called Sonic Rush Adventure. You'd be sure that this game would have been a smash hit with critics and fans alike, but unfortunately this was one of those cases where the sequel couldn't live up to the hype of the prequel. This game was not nearly as loved, to say the least. It didn't do too well in sales, and even to this day it's pretty forgotten about. Even so, maybe it shouldn't be. It has a lot going for it, and tons of people still love it, so maybe a little friendly competition is in order. Hey, it's Nana Plays Games, aka MPG. Welcome to something I'm gonna call a prequel versus sequel fight, where I look at two games that are directly linked to each other and put them against each other in specific categories. The winner will receive a point, and whichever game has the most points at the end will be considered better. Some takes will be subjective, but you should also tally up your own personal score and see who wins. With that being said, let's start the game. The Rush games are best known for their boost mechanics and tricking system, something a lot of people seem to love. The Rush and Rush Adventure mechanics and abilities between games are basically the same, but even then, there are some quirks about the gameplay between games. This section might be considered a bit unfair considering that Sonic Rush doesn't have any real things to do outside of the main game, but there's a reason why I'm bringing it up here. Rush is about half as long as Rush Adventure, and without the collection of chaos emeralds and the special stages attached to them, it doesn't have much else for the player to do. Some people may even find a problem with how the game forces players to complete each zone as both Sonic and Blaze, making the game about twice as long as it would be without this quirk. Rush doesn't have much going on other than its time attacks in 2-player mode, but some people prefer the less is better approach. Rush Adventure attempts to go in a completely different direction with the introduction of various in-game objectives. The game requires players to get to levels via different vehicles, marking their own path and playing different quote-unquote mini-games as they make their way to their destination. This is a neat concept minus the fact that the mini-games aren't too fun or creative, it can feel super repetitive. The game also requires you to collect materials in order to upgrade these vehicles or you won't be getting very far. In order to collect enough material, you need to replay specific stages, and I say specific because each zone carries a different type of material. There's just a bit too much that goes on in Rush Adventure, and it's not exactly the most innovative gameplay ever, which is why I have to give the first point to Rush. Some may disagree, but in this case, I do think that less is better. So let's move on to the second round. The level design in many 2D Sonic games are either loved or hated with no room for an in-between, and the level design in Rush Adventure are no exception. The Rush games, the first one specifically, can be quite infamous for its level design due to being made by DIMS, the same devs of the Advanced Trilogy. If you know this, you'll know that you shouldn't be fooled by Rush's breathtakingly gorgeous levels. The game's levels are designed for going fast, of course, but the game tends to throw many elements your way that you may not be able to react to. Just like in the advanced games, Rush has many moments where things can unexpectedly instant-kill you. Even when you're aware of the stakes, sometimes it's inevitable for you to fall to your death, as the bottomless pits are plentiful. Some gimmicks can also be awkward, as the game doesn't give you much time to get used to how they control, and they usually never appear again. Each level provides different gimmicks, and most are creative and seamlessly fun, but this isn't always the case. It can also be pretty awkward to go from high-speed fun to having to do time-based objectives, platform quickly above certain death, or even wait. The levels aren't all bad, as I still like the majority of them just fine, but the major flaws some of them have can't really be ignored. Rush Adventure's levels are a lot safer to play, and dare I say more fun. Bottomless pits aren't too common, the gimmicks are pretty easy to get used to, and the designs of the levels never feel too awkward or punishing. Sometimes you might catch glimpses of DIMS' old tendencies, but it never happens enough to call it a pattern. The levels never lose their creativity, as they all look beautiful and make the Soul Universe look like an interesting place to explore. So this round is gonna have to go to Sonic Rush Adventure. Despite the fact that it may seem too easy for some people, me included, it's nice to boost through a game without too many hiccups. Now we're ready to move on to round 3. Again, like with levels, 2D games have a bit of a rough history with boss fights, so this should be interesting. Rush's bosses are, to put it bluntly, not too much fun. Due to how the bosses are set up, it can feel like they go on forever. For instance, players will have to wait for an enemy to attack before having a chance to attack themselves, but this brief opening only comes after having to dodge attacks and sit still for a bit longer than desired. There are rarely any checkpoints in 2D bosses, so no hard feelings there, but what makes Rush's bosses a bit frustrating is the fact that you have to do the attack and wait sequence multiple times, 8 to be exact. It doesn't make it better that the bosses sometimes do one-hit kills, only adding to said frustration. It stretches out the time necessary to defeat the boss, and in my opinion, it's not in an honest way. Just like with the levels, you need to defeat every boss twice, which definitely isn't great considering the bosses aren't implemented too well. Even then, I think the bosses' concepts are really neat, and the area in which they usually take place may be tight and confined, but they're otherwise really pretty to look at as you're trying not to die. Again, the bosses aren't egregious or anything, but they definitely need some work and polish. Rush Adventure's bosses manage to be both creative and fun to play around with, as the game doesn't give you a hit minimum. You're usually allowed to attack when you want, and though you have to slow it down during enemy attacks, you'll still be able to fight back. The game typically gives you space to move around at your leisure in differing ways, with every boss being unique from one another. I also prefer the health bar approach, as it feels good to chip away at an enemy's health with well-timed attacks. So this round is going to Rush Adventure for its more enjoyable and original boss fights. Let's get a move on to round 4. Special stages in Sonic games can be optional sometimes, but sometimes they're not. Rush and Rush Adventure both make special stages mandatory in order to fully complete the game's campaigns, so them being fun and well optimized is important. Like always, we'll start off with Sonic Rush's special stages. Rush brings back the half-pipe stage layout and has a very similar premise as Sonic 2's half-pipe. The player must meet a ring minimum in order to advance to every quote-unquote stage of the special zone, and if that's done a few times, they'll be granted with a Chaos Emerald. These special stages can get pretty tricky, especially when you get to the last 3 emeralds. Enemies get more plentiful, gaps between obstacles get smaller, and there's more to react to on top of the QTE difficulties. Granted, these special stages are simple, straightforward, and don't have much to them, but that's what makes them charming. Moving on to Rush Adventure, these special stages are a little more unique. Instead of a rehashed special stage layout, the game has you engaging in a race with arguably the most fun vehicle to use in the game. You race across the water with Johnny, another green pain in the ass for Sonic, dodge obstacles, do tricks, what you usually do when you're on a water bike, but a little harder. The races, just like Rush's half-pipes, can get very tricky while trying to get the last couple of emeralds, though the order you get them in may not be chronological. Like with the levels in the game, Rush Adventure requires you to find the races yourself on the map, so you might hit a difficult race before you're ready. The races may be fun, but there's only so much you can do with them. Surprisingly, I'm gonna have to give this round's point to Sonic Rush, though it was a close one. So let's move on to our last round of the game. This is gonna determine everything. A lot of 2D Sonic games usually have a bare-bones narrative, but Rush and Rush Adventure try to immerse the players into its story and events. Rush seems to take the simpler approach and has the game only briefly explore some already established characters while giving a lot of spotlight to the new one at the time. Certain characters who aren't too important don't interact very much with the rest of the cast, which can sometimes feel awkward but isn't too much of a bother. I do wish that certain characters got more time to interact, like Sonic and Blaze, since they're both on the cover of the game and it doesn't seem like they speak too much. Even so, I think the game does well at establishing Blaze's character, characterizing Sonic accurately, and moving the story along at a brisk pace. Everything is simple, you understand the stakes, and nothing overstays its welcome. Rush Adventure, on the other hand, takes a heavier-handed approach when it comes to the story. Rush Adventure had some big shoes to fill, with it being Blaze's dimension and the game needing to do some world building. The levels and vehicle segments did well to establish the visuals of Blaze's universe in contrast to Sonic's, but now the game's story had to explore the inhabitants and other happenings going on. This is quite the task, so I understand the game being more dialogue and narrative heavy, but a lot of the time the game slowed to a halt and felt like not much was happening. The only new character of note was Marine, while the others were kinda samey and lifeless compared to the ones in Sonic's dimension. Instead of the events of the game being clear or at least semi-transparent from the beginning, it was more mysterious about what was happening. I could have enjoyed this more if there was a new big bad, but for the events of the story to drag as long as they did and have the Eggmans be the villains at the end was just anticlimactic to say the least. It could have been nice to see Blaze make more friends, maybe them being counterparts to Sonic's friends, and seeing a new villain take the center stage in a 2D game. The story wasn't bad, of course, but it also could have been a lot better than it was, so I'll have to give this point to Rush. Now let's move on to the results. It's time to answer the question of, what's better, Sonic Rush or Sonic Rush Adventure? Drumroll please. Sonic Rush. Even though Rush Adventure deserves its flowers, Rush is the more popular game for a reason. Though the level design and bosses of Rush Adventure are leagues better, the overall playing experience in Rush is just a little more enjoyable, at least for me. If you played, let me know who won for you in the comments and why. I have a feeling the answers will definitely vary. And that's it for our first prequel versus sequel fight. Rush and Rush Adventure are 2 Sonic games I played a million times as a kid and still love replaying as an adult. I've always switched back and forth between which game was better, so it's good to finally have a definite answer, though it may be subject to change. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe. This is MPG, I'll see you later. Peace!